that many stories that I have spring from a circumstance that he just described, where they're somehow connected to someone that I'm dealing with, wherever it is in the world. And I call them synchronicities, and I have a whole write-up on this. It's really pretty amazing. I'm so happy to be here this morning, and when I heard the reading of what this day had in its history, many of the things that were mentioned really kind of play into the story that became the impact on my father's life. I had the opportunity really in the last 14 years now that I've been working on this, as I did research, and I've ended up writing 3 books on this topic, and I've just started 1 book about my mother's life, to really travel the world and realize how fragile our world is. And now we're seeing it playing out right before us in our eyes. And so a lot of the history that I'm going to tell you today really sounds and echoes like what was happening for my dad. So I wanted to try, because I think, as we all know, and you history buffs know, that history really shows trends and things that happen. Not only do we learn from it, but we really need to pay attention to what it's telling us. And certainly the things that were playing out with the Sudetenland and the Munich Agreement. There's a movie out right now about the Munich Agreement worth watching that tells you that. Because, that land, which, of course, like a lot of times through history, we know it causes problems later, that countries are pieced together from historic lands. And that was one of them, and that was a largely German-populated area, but a lot of Czechs lived there too. And that Munich Agreement, without any consultation of the Czechoslovakian country, was deeded back to Hitler. And my father actually was an officer, a medical officer in the Czechoslovak army, and was sent there to oversee, with other Czechs, the loss of that property. And then, of course, this leads us to the topic of today that we're dealing with. Because 6 months later, the Nazis took Czechoslovakia, the lands of Bohemia and Moravia, and made it part of what was called the Protectorate, the German Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. And so it didn't take long for Hitler to move on. And as you know, Putin took back Crimea in a period of time that really led us to where we are in today's tumult. These I put it together to show you, like Ovid said, my father ended up being part of the refugee group that survived because they made it to China, and I'll go into that in more depth. But these are, that's the picture right there is one that my father took in Shanghai, and it's a bombed building by the Japanese, because the Japanese were back at war with the Chinese at that time. And then you recognize from today what's happening. So we don't know how it'll end, but I did want to say, how President Zelensky, who I feel like is kind of the conscience of the world right now, when he said that, and when asked about, I think Lester Holt asked him about World War III, the comments about it, he said, we don't know if we're in World War III. We may already be in World War III. So when you think of the things that unfolded in my father's lifetime, when, first you lost Sudetenland, and then you went on to 6 months later the Czech lands, and then 6 months after that began World War II, as we call it. So I thought it echoed with me, because I thought maybe we don't know, really, we are already in it. So I'm going to run you through really quickly kind of my life. This is a little personal background in that I was raised in Brevard County in Melbourne Beach and in the Atlantic. I knew, not much, and then there was a big discovery that I'll tell you about. The search and research and findings and legacy are kind of what I want to share. So you can see here, that was kind of the idyllic life on the beach. It was the time when the space industry started up in Brevard, and my father actually was the 7th doctor at the Brevard Hospital on the staff, and he was he became the doctor that did the employment physicals for 3 of the biggest early space companies that were over there building the rockets that at that time were just kind of falling into the sea. And so he has a certificate that I have that proclaims him a space pioneer and given to him. And it was back then, it was called, the Cape Kennedy there. I mean, before Cape Kennedy, it was Cape Canaveral. So that's my family in a holiday card. So my parents, as Ovid said, met and married in China. My father, as a Czech refugee, that's a map of how he got there. And then he went into the interior of China, and he was working as a doctor in a place called Pingtingxing, kind of in the middle of nowhere, and he took a train ride to buy supplies for that hospital, and he went into what was called Peking and Beijing. And my mother, who had been born in China, she had returned to America to become a teacher, and she was just back on a ship. And she met my father at the welcome party that he happened to be there, and it was instant love. And I have them on recorded saying how they thought about that moment. It really was love at first sight. And 5 weeks later, they were married. So it lasted 60 years. So when I was growing up, what did I know? I knew that my father had traveled through 5 continents to eventually settle in Melbourne. He told great stories. He was a wonderful storyteller, and so I knew a lot of the adventure stories. I knew his heritage was Jewish. I knew that they were typical kind of a lot of Bohemian Jews. They weren't highly religious, but they did go to high holy days, and he was proud of that background. My paternal great-grandparents and great-grandmother, I knew when I was growing up, had died, and I'll come back to that in a little while. My parents seemed to, have happy, well-adjusted lives on a beautiful island that we grew up on, and they were greatly involved in their community, so I saw that as role models. I was raised with no fear. My father showed no prejudice about what had happened to him, and as you know, Holocaust education wasn't even in school, so you knew very little about it, and people that had had any piece of that, most of them obviously didn't talk about it. So then my parents died of natural causes within 2 days of each other, right at the beginning of the new millennium, January 1st and January 3rd, and that was a very hard time for our family. But we also were celebrating 2 lives really well lived. And that was when the discovery was made. So when they died, they lived in a condominium on the beach, and it was like they had walked out the day before. And so my brother, sister, and I started going through all of their things and trying to figure out, what we would each want, really, on our inheritance. And in that, see that little Chinese box on the top? That's one of the places. There were 2 of those. But there were other places that we found these 400 letters by 78 writers. There were all kinds of other things there, like pictures, albums, journals. Those are my father's escape pants, so I'll come to that story. And then just a lot of things. My dad was an artist. That's one of his artwork, so everywhere he went, even when he was in medical school, he drew things. So the collection is very significant. I waited until 2008 to start working and they were all most of them were in Czech. There were some in German, some in French for certain reasons, but keep it on the thing. Anyway, so it was really something that when I got into it, I knew that it was really significant. And so the first place I went was the United States Holocaust Museum, and they really kind of adopted me because it is an incredible collection of letters that are not only from these 78 different people, and there are documents, many documents that go with it, but my father saved 70 carbon copies of his own letters when he was in China. I think he did it. You know how sometimes now if you write an email, a long email, you can just save it so you remember what you said to somebody. Well, I think that's what he was doing. He was keeping track of who he was writing to and telling them what, because there were so many people that he was conversing with. So I think that's why. But he was a beautiful writer. and he pours his heart out. So I got to know my father very well from that period of time. So now I know a lot more. Starting in 1987, I did 7 hours of interviews with my father, and again, I had no idea what the real background story was, but he was telling me a lot of adventure stories. Every once in a while he would get to things that were a little bit difficult, but as you might imagine, in the middle of a busy life with a family and a business and a lot of other things going on, I listened to a little of it, and then I put it away, and I hadn't really listened to it. And after he died then, and I started doing myself to understand it all, I took it out and listened to it again. And then I had different eyes and different heart and mind, really, that I was applying to it, and it became such a gift. But also, sorry, keep it from going automatic. Let's see. Also, what happened was in 1993, when Schindler's List came out, I was in Orlando, and I went over there and I asked my father if he would want to see the movie with me. I realized later when I did see it why that wasn't a good idea, but he said absolutely no, he didn't want to see it. And that night he sat down and I sat next to him, and on his old typewriter he typed out the names of 44 relatives that he knew had died in the Holocaust, and where he thought they had died, when they were taken away, and he put codes with it, like the relationship, and again where he thought they died. Most of them were taken first to Terezin, which was a camp. It's Theresienstadt in German, but in northeastern Czech lands, and then they were transported on to Auschwitz. I learned later he got his parents wrong. They didn't die at Auschwitz. They likely died at a death camp called Sobibor. And then another uncle of my father's died at Dachau instead of where he thought he did. But other than that, remember, there was no internet, there was no U.S. Holocaust Museum to help you research, nothing. So this was information that he had gathered from family that survived in the Czech lands over time. So I owned an engineering firm, and when I sold it, I decided that I would get very immersed in this, and I started going on research trips over to Europe. That's my husband, Roger Neiswender, on the bottom corner on the right. Some of you know him. And he has been an amazing, patient, and loving partner in all of this. He's gone everywhere. He does research with me. He supports me in everything. And even this morning at the breakfast table, he was listening to me again, telling him what I might tell you. So it's been very special. I've met a lot of people. I've met relatives that were in the Czech lands. The older people in that picture where I'm leaning over, that's my cousin Thomas on the right side. But the other ones were all very vibrant and alive when I started, and they've all passed away. But I got their stories. I hired somebody to interview the two men who both had very interesting stories when they were young during the Holocaust period. So I have them on long tapes and they're all translated, so they're a valuable thing to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the U.S. Shoah Foundation too. Sobibor, we've been to many concentration camps. Sobibor is a story unto itself. I would ask you to look it up and read it because it's very important to know. But it reminds me kind of the ruthlessness of Hitler, of Putin right now, and what's capable for we humans to do to one another at that place. So I want to play, if I can get this to work. When I interviewed my father, he told me about his escape and those pants. And by the way, he described the pants vividly, but he never told us that he kept those pants. And when we were going through my parents' things, in the bottom of my mom's linens, where she had a lot of tablecloths folded, in a drawer at the bottom of them were this pair of pants. And my brother and sister, who didn't do the interviews with my dad, it didn't click with them, but I said, these are his escape pants. So in the interview, he told me the escape story. And the escape story was he was in the Czech army when the Nazis came in March 15th, 1939. He was with a whole army unit. They didn't know really, they got the news that the Germans were in there, but they didn't know what to do, so they were kind of moving around, and then finally these German generals came by train, and they all took them into custody, so to speak, and nobody really knew what would happen. So my father said for 2 weeks, as the doctor of the unit, he was kind of dealing with runny noses and football, soccer injuries, because everybody was just killing time, and he finally said, I want to go home. His parents were in Prague, and so he asked his driver, named Václav, if he wanted to go home. He knew Václav lived actually near that area, and Václav said sure, and so my father said, go get the car, we're going out. And so my dad sat down and he wrote orders to go and inspect the meat, which was something, the meats that would be prepared for the soldiers. That was one thing that the doctor could do. So I'm going to turn this on, and I forget sometimes when it kind of starts off, but he's telling you then when he goes to go out the gate with the German. Anybody see the little mouse? Where is it? No cursor. I can't see it.
There was a German guard over there, they stopped us. They asked me in German where I was going, so I handed them my order, which was written in Czech. Well, these poor fellows didn't know what it was all about, so they asked me whether I could translate it. I said, yep. So they handed me back my letter that I wrote myself. I could have translated without looking in. So I translated in German, and they pricked their heels and said, alles in Ordnung, all is all right. And we started out of the barracks. So we drove about 3-4 blocks from the barracks and turned around in a side street. So we parked the car and shook hands and walked away from it.
So as you might imagine, he was then a traitor, and the Germans would have killed him if they could have found him, but he made his way to Prague. So when I started, I knew because of a letter that was addressed to my dear boy from my grandfather to my father. It was the first letter I had translated, and I'm going to come back to that later, but I knew that I was going to write this book about my dad's life, and I was working on it under my dear boy, so I was writing a lot of early stuff just to get it down. When I started getting translated letters back, and they were coming to me in random order. I didn't know who anybody was. And it wasn't by date and everything. It was kind of chaotic, and these letters were coming in, but then when I would get a few of one person, I would think, I wonder what happened to them, and I could tell by the translations kind of what their role was a little bit, and I was guessing. And one of them I knew because she was a cousin, the lady Hannah on the left side. I knew her name was Hannah Bell, and she made it to Great Britain, and so she was someone I knew, but the other people I really didn't know. So I started on this journey, and one of my father's letters, he called them themselves, he called them adventures against, or he called his friends adventures against their will, and I thought that was exactly what they were. This is the book trailer, which kind of gives you the summary of what it's about.
shattered, and life or death decisions had to be made in an instant. This is a story you might never be told its son through a stunning discovery. After her parents died in 2000, Joanie Schrim found, hidden in some old Chinese boxes, 400 letters from 78 different writers to and from her father. When translated, the letters revealed an amazing story.
I broke down and cried when I read that first letter. It was heartbreaking.
The letters were a window into Schrim's past, an unprecedented documentation of events that changed human history.
And then suddenly their letters stopped, and I had to know more. And so I went in search, and I found descendants for them all over the world.
Schrim's relentless worldwide search uncovered the true story of relatives murdered in death camps, of young friends and their dramatic escapes to 4 continents, stories about the will to live, the nobility of human dignity, and the pain and guilt of betrayed lovers and of friends and family left behind. Only rarely does a work of nonfiction have the gripping emotional core of a best-selling novel. Adventurers Against Their Will by Joanie Schrim is that rare exception. Former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright calls Adventurers Against Their Will a brilliant and compelling account of men and women caught in the turbulence of war. Their world is about to explode. Their lives will be changed forever. They're about to become adventurers against their will. Sometimes fact is even more dramatic than fiction.
So I'm going to read you, I think the best way that I can introduce you to these people is how I got introduced to them. And each of them were friends or cousins, and they were very, and Czechs are very close-knit, I would tell you. So that most of them knew each other from childhood, and you know, there's no pretense to a lot of what they say. This is Karel Schoenbaum, who became Carl Sheldon in America later. He was a very accomplished lawyer. All of these people went to Charles University together, which was the oldest university in Europe, second oldest university in Europe. It has a wonderful medical school, and it has a wonderful law school. And back then, the Czechs were very open to women advancing in professional level. They had a president, Thomas Masaryk, that really pushed that. And so a lot of my dad's friends, were women lawyers. So Karel ends up, he was involved in the Social Democratic Party, which several of them were, which were really anti-Hitler and well known to be that. And he got a tip working in the Skoda international business that the Nazis were coming in early. That's actually, there were several times that happened. And so he knew that he needed to leave. And all of the parents that I talk about, all of them decide to stay behind. So it's the sad thread of all these people losing their parents and other relatives that stayed behind. But he managed to get out, and he first went to London, and he went to Oxford University and started working he first was working with the Czech army and Czech government in exile. That's where they had fled after the Germans. The president actually went to America, Beneš, but then he went to London. And I will tell you that some of my Czech friends, I'm very close to a lot of the Czechs now, and cousins and everything, they were really mad because Beneš left. And I think of Zelensky now staying and what that's done for his people. But Beneš left, and it was a choice he made. But he left his people, and that stays with them today in legend. So he goes, and he becomes, interestingly enough, he actually, Karel, becomes pretty important because they set up at Oxford this thing that is for all the Czechs that had come there and have something to do with Oxford at that time, and it was very prestigious. And at one point, I learned that his sister, he has two brothers and a sister, And his sister had made it to America. Her husband was a doctor, and they came a little bit early, maybe like 1938. But they knew things were kind of boiling at that point, and so they took the wife of Karel. They took her china to America, and they also took Karel's very favored coat, big long wool coat, I guess. So they took things with them to protect them, and they were hoping that if they needed to, they would come to America. And Karel, actually, when I interviewed, I met his wife, who was 91 years old, and the daughter, and had wonderful time with them. And she told me the story about how Karel was the head of this group at Oxford, and when Benish came to talk to them, he got to go and wear that coat. His sister had mailed him the coat so he would have it in London, and they went to meet the Queen. So it was a big story in the family, as you might imagine. So anyway, Karel was very, very intelligent, he never wanted to be a soldier, is kind of what at some point is said. He wasn't one that wanted to go to war. So anyway, he writes, my father, this is June 6, 1939, and my father left to go to China in May of 1939. And so it's interesting to me, and I learned a lot about mail, how it reached my father along the way. This might have, reached him on the ship through a stop even. Imagine that, on your way to China. But he may have gotten it when he got to China. I don't really know that, but the experts I dealt with on mail said it was pretty amazing. Anyway, he writes my father, I am very glad you know that you, at least for a while, are anchored in Hong Kong. Dad stopped in Hong Kong before he went to Shanghai. These are strange times. Everyone is in a different part of the world. Who would have thought last year that we would live in not exactly a pretty small room in a dirty section of London and write to you in some place far away in Asia? Maybe we'll meet there sometime soon, or in the trenches. I read your letter to Bala. That's a common friend, and I'm going to tell you about him too. He will no doubt answer all your concrete questions, especially since you sent him $1 for postage. I hope you will soon find yourself a job. I wish it for you. If I were to write you about our life here, it is mainly that we are waiting. I run about interminable streets of London and constantly try to find a way to get friends and relatives out of our homeland, to which, God willing, we might return someday. You surely know yourself that those of us who are aware of our responsibilities towards our people, merely because we are here, have the depressing knowledge that we can achieve practically nothing, and that remains with us. Slowly we are becoming political activists or leaders of the fight abroad. That is how they might call us, mockingly. The English are very kind to us, especially when we don't want anything from them. They frequently invite us over for a weekend, for tea, etc. But as the future, there isn't any, of course. And I want you to think of, as I read this, think about the people that are in Ukraine right now, either trapped behind or out in Poland now. And the letters that, that I pull back out right now just echo everything that they're feeling. It's the same way and the same loss. The thing that's different is that the Czech lands, the Nazis did not destroy it. In fact, Hitler saw it as a prize, really, and so he wanted to preserve it. So it's a very unique thing that Czechoslovakia really at the time never was damaged. So this is his brother Franta, and I think Karel is about 2 years older than my dad. Franta was the same exact age. They had, their grandfather lived in the little town Benešov, which is 25 miles from Prague, where my father grew up, and the grandfathers knew each other, kind of thing. Karel was, I would call him, he was the bad boy, a little bit of my investigation. Franta had a business degree from Charles University. This is his wife Andela and their son Honza in Czech, John. And as you see, John I got to know. He lives in New Zealand. My husband and I went to New Zealand and met him. He was one of the first people that really helped me understand totally what had happened to his family. Hansa was 5 years old when the war started for the Czechs. Remember, it was 6 months earlier than the real World War II started. His parents, she was not, Handela was not Jewish, Franta was. So at the beginning there was a thought maybe he wouldn't be threatened, but that turned to be not true later. And they started really worrying about their son, and so they found strangers that owned a pub far out in the countryside, and they paid them, and they took Hansa there and left him there, and he was there for almost 4 years with strangers at a young age. And I will tell you that when John, now in his 80s, tells me these stories, he is overcome with grief to this day. He tells me that when he finally, after the war, they all survived. Franta was taken to Terezin, but it was towards the end of the war, and luckily he survived. He came back, and actually Andela had another son. But when John came back, he told me that he was so afraid from the experience that he had that when his mother would go to the bathroom, he would go stand outside the door and shake until she came out. And they tried to put him in school, he would get sick. I'm thinking again about all these kids you're looking at that are in, or that are refugees of today, and what stays with you for your whole entire life, that trauma of what it was about. In the end, Franta had wondering eyes, I would tell you. Andela was one of my favorite letter writers. I just fell in love with her. And she was so strong and so good, but eventually she had enough and she divorced Franta, and they moved to New Zealand. So that's where he grew up. He only saw his father one more time during his whole life. And I have a synchronicity story. I don't have time really to tell you the synchronicity story, but I found someone that knew him really well by chance when I was giving a speech in Prague, and I was able to put that person in touch with John to give him the history of his own father's life. So, Franta, this is him. This is my dad writing Franta. Let me see, let me get this right. This is Franta, my dad writing Franta about his experience, and I won't read the whole thing, but it's kind of gives you an idea of my dad's life in Shanghai. This is Shanghai, July 20th, 1939, so my father has just arrived there. He says, Franta, don't be angry with me that I am bothering you. I have had no news from home for a month already. Please call my family and tell them to write me airmail, and he gives the address. If something would happen, God forbid, with the family, write it to me, please do so that I can possibly help them somehow if it would be possible. I am also including a letter for Pavel Corporate, which is a friend of theirs. He wants to come here, so I must work him out a little so that he would not be surprised. If some of you are in the bad way, perhaps, come here. It is better here, despite all the misery, than in Prague or in Europe in general. Notably, one can work here, and I will be already sitting probably at a place with a medical practice by the time I can help you. What he's saying is because the Jews were not allowed to practice medicine or law after Hitler, and so none of them had jobs. In fact, Franta was doing street work, digging ditches and such. Thank you for your lovely letter. In the meantime, you received undoubtedly my chattering from the ship. We must stay in writing contact all the time. You have no idea how happy you made me with that letter of yours. You know, when a man doesn't hear that dialect of ours anymore, at least one can have something for enjoyable reading again. To tell you the truth, that distance is not so big, and it does not seem so huge, but I'm damnably homesick for all and for everything, particularly when a man is almost entirely without news, and when he does not know when and if at all he will return. Such thoughts would develop in your head only after some time. Do not be angry that I am responding to your cheerful letter with such sentimental blabbering, but it is called Shanghai depression, And supposedly everybody is going through that during their first time. After all, you know that is not my nature. This is, again, one of my favorite letters because he describes all of Shanghai at that moment and what's happening. This is Bala, one of the more interesting characters. He was a lawyer. He was very involved in politics and anti-Hitler stuff, and he also was able to get out very early. He wrote a letter that I call a resume for life. He sought out someone in America, and just 6 days, he didn't know the Nazis were coming that quickly, 6 days before they arrived, he wrote a letter to a Karel Wallenberger in America, and I wrote an article that was printed in a British newspaper, and a woman in America who was doing research about her uncle, Karel Wallenberger, had that letter and read my article that's called Finding Bala. It was all about what I went through to find Bala in Canada and meet his family. And that letter, I have it in my book, Adventures Against Their Will, was amazing because he was writing a total stranger that he thought was probably related to him, a letter saying, would you sponsor me in America? And it's about his family, and it's very professionally desperate when you read it. It's heartbreaking. Of course, Karel in America got the letter, but Karel Wallenberger couldn't come at that point, and his family. So here's what happened. So this is his family, the woman on the top in the middle, that was his family at the time, Milena. And Milena's father, a man named Langer, was a very well-known, respected family, very wealthy, and her father was a lawyer. And Karel wanted her to go with them and their 2 children, but the father didn't want her to be destitute in London. And so he said, stay and we'll get you there later. Well, that was what you don't know, like you don't know in Ukraine today. What's going to happen next? Well, what happened next is that opportunity never came. Karel went to London. He was, working with the other Karel Schoenbaum. And he ends up going to fight for the British Army, the Czechs that joined the British Army, and he was in France and he got injured. And he never knew his wife and children were dead until after the war. But he ends up, Mima right there becomes his second wife, and she was one of Milena's best friends. She and her family had made it to America before the war started, and she joined the United Nations Relief Act to go to the refugee camps afterwards. And she ends up going, she knew that Karel was in London, and she goes to see him, and they end up getting married, and they have the 2 children on the side there, Anne and Nick. Anne has since passed away. Nick is a professor in a school in Canada. And Hugh was somebody that showed up along the way because Hugh was an illegitimate son of Bala in London. And Hugh came much later to the other kids when Bala died and said, here I am. And at first they thought, oh, what's he want? But he wanted friendship. And he and Nick are like true brothers now and everything. It was this amazing story that I got caught up in what this was happening. Anyway, so Bala ended up being a very successful businessman in Canada. So Bala's writing my father. It's May 24th, 1939. So again, a very early letter in this collection that I have. He says, Dear Valdik, is my dad's nickname. I am writing to you in a rush so that this letter still reaches you in Marseille, which was the point where my father was leaving from, the port. I am truly happy that you managed to escape from Prague. I was forcing the thing here bravely too and assuming your assent. I will leave the matter to run here in case the Far East pleased you. It is a pitiful sight to see all the acquaintances to set out for the 7 seas, and you particularly. I would not imagine on the road Monash, that was their favorite cafe, to Shanghai. But then Hitler has us where he wanted us. Thank you sincerely for the news. I just don't understand whether the 10 jewels and the Leica were also in the suitcase. The suitcase arrived in order and I immediately stored it. So what I do know from interviews and everything is that my dad sent a big suitcase to him to store for him, but he never got that later, and because Bala left anyway. So you wonder about things that you come up with. He says, I am doing relatively great. Both Kadel, Schoenbaum, and I are employed at the British Committee. We have a royal income of approximately £2 a week, from which one can very well survive. We have a lot of work. We are in an office continuously from 10 until evening, and we are registering Czech immigrants and carrying out all the kinds of tasks on behalf of the Czech group. There is, however, no future in it, and even though we are searching for another job, we are still holding on to the committee tooth and nail. The mood among the emigres here is altogether gloomy. Prospects none, and immigration possibilities totally negligible. Physicians still have it best, but it is also nothing special. The difference, as opposed to Prague, is only the feeling that here you are safe, even though thanks to our co-religionists' appearance and conduct, the grudge towards immigrants is strongly rising. So there was an anti-Semitism, where they were all ending up going. I'll keep moving along. Time. This is Hannah. Hannah is a first cousin of my father, quite a bit younger. She grew up very wealthy. Her father was a very well-known engineer in Prague. A lot of the buildings that we go to would have a presence of her father's work. Her story, that's her on the top right with her parents. So her mother was my grandfather's, one of his sisters. Only one sister survived out of my grandfather's family. And Hannah was 19 when she went to Great Britain. She became a nanny and a maid, and a lot of her letters are just really wonderful in terms of her spirit, because she's doing things she never would have imagined, that her life was going to be like, but she's doing it all kind of in the way that you would have to survive. And she ends up marrying into one of Britain's very famous families. Idris Bell was the son of the keeper of the manuscripts of the London Museum, which would be like the head of the Smithsonian. And so I found, each of these I could go on for hours to tell you how I found them and everything, but the family there on the left, the nephew Owen Bell, is the nephew of her husband, and he was a Anglican priest. Now he's a retired Anglican priest, and we get together with them regularly. He's just been delightful and shared all the stories of Hannah, and then those are her two daughters. I'm in touch with Stephanie regularly still to this day. Let me see. So Hannah. My father writes Hannah a letter on September 15th, 1939. So remember, the war in Poland started September 1st. Dear Hanneke, so my father actually went up to northern China for a while to take care of what they called an old China hand. He was a man that came to China during World War II and had fought in Russia, actually. And he came, and so my father, when he soon gets there, that's his first job, is taking care of this sick man who was traveling. And so they had been in North China. So he says, I just came from North China and found a lot of letters from home here. Among other news, I was glad to read that you had managed to leave for England. Since all the extensive correspondence was said, much has changed. I am afraid that the war will turn not only us, but the whole existing order upside down, and that we will have to be getting used to various novelties. Regarding the reports from home, which are now, at least here, quite numerous, one has to maintain distance and calm. We have to remain courageous, whatever happens. I hope that our family will overcome this storm without ruin, and that we will all safely meet again in our dear homeland. I don't know how well you are doing in England, and I would definitely be interested to know what you are doing and what you possibly need, how I could maybe somehow help you. I recently got a position as the head of an ambulatory, and I was just about to open my medical office when the war came. Since I don't know whether I will be going to Europe, I had to postpone this plan. But even the current employment is providing me with a decent income, and therefore I beg you not to hesitate, and should you need anything, write to me. I repeat, and I will do all I can. So they end up with a very wonderful correspondence, and she never calls on him for help, and he's always saying, "Can I help you? Can I help you?" when he's in China. It's just, you know, when you think about how that all feels and how that unfolds with the people that you love that are in their circumstance. Let's see, Hannah writes, "My father, thank you for your nice letter, which I received a few days ago. I didn't quite understand from that letter exactly where you are, whether you're alternatively in Hong Kong and China, or Shanghai, or whether you were in Shanghai. You also write you might be going back to Europe. Do you still intend to do so? Would you go to France, or was it just a plan? The times are so crazy these days, and the situation changes with every day, completely upside down. So one can now hardly make any decisions. But even if there are changes to the better in the world, which I sincerely doubt, for us Jews, it will be very difficult to get back to the old ways and start some meaningful existence, whether somewhere abroad or at home again. The worst thing, however, in both your case and mine, is the fact that our parents are there and we are outside. Are you in touch with them just as before, or do your letters arrive slowly?" And she goes on, her letters are really very emotional when you read them, because she's young and she's very, very close to her parents, and it's just really sad when you read it. Now, Hannah, you know, the Czechs were freed, actually kind of purposely, by the Russians, who had, obviously the Soviets, who had later intentions to create the lands that they did under the Iron Curtain. And so there was an agreement that was made that the Soviets, unknowing that or not thinking of it well, the U.S. allowed the Soviets to be the ones that marched into the Czech lands and freed them. And then, so that happened in 1945. In 1948, there was the communists took over in Czechoslovakia, and for 40 years they were behind the Iron Curtain. Hannah, my father went back first in 1963. I don't know if anybody remembers kind of the spring period, they called it, in the Czech lands, where they thought they were moving towards more freedom. And then what happened was my dad went there with my mother. It was his first trip back since the war, and my mother's first trip there. And he was very afraid to go because he was afraid the communists wouldn't let him out, but it all worked out okay. Hannah went back in 1968, and that was her first trip back. And while she was there were the invasion, the tanks that rolled into the Czech lands. So imagine that. She had escaped, left all that, and while she's there, that happens, and she had brought her two young daughters. So she was afraid that all three of them wouldn't get out. They got out, and it was because of the miraculous work of my young cousin that you saw earlier, Tomasa, and there's a whole story that goes with that. I don't know where I am on your timing, if you keep going for a little while. Okay, I'll tell it all in. The one letter I want to read you is about my grandparents, real quickly. My grandparents, as I said, perished at Sobibor. The history of my family now, I know, goes back over 300 years in Bohemia. I have a huge tree now showing you all of that family, and then there's a large part of the tree that perished in the Holocaust. My grandparents, I have 44 letters from my grandparents to my father. So that's how I met them. And these I'll skip over, but these are their transport when they were taken from Terezin, and they went to the Lublin area in Poland, which is the area that was over, the Nazis had over all these concentration and death camps in that area. So the first letter I had translated turned out to be the last letter that my grandfather wrote my father. And there's a whole story with how that happened that way, meant to be. But that was how I met my grandfather. So I'm going to read you this letter. I had sold my engineering company. They wanted to throw a party for me. I said, let's wait until spring, and I love Jimmy Buffett. We'll do a Jimmy Buffett party. That was all kind of being planned and going to happen this week, that I found this letter in a different place than any of the other letters, and I wanted to have it translated, and as life would have it, a guy that worked with me, his girlfriend's boyfriend, was Czech, and he was a writer and everything, and so he said, I'll send it to him. So he sent it to him, and his wife got back in touch and said, this is a very sad letter, and Mirik Katzel was his name, really wants to take time on it and get it right, and so he'll send it to you on Friday. On Thursday was this party that was all joy of a career, had a 35-year career in the business of engineering, and we were celebrating all that with a lot of my clients and friends, and my son had come to town. My daughter was there, lived in town, but my son came to town for that event. We had a wonderful time, and the next day, the wife called my husband and said, Mirik's sending it, tell her, don't let her be alone when she reads it. And so my son was there, so he said, I'll sit with you, Mom. So we sat down on the couch, and I started reading it. And I always have trouble reading it. April 21st, 1942. My dear boy, today we are leaving for a gathering point so that in 3 or 4 days we can follow the fate of those unfortunate people who since last October have been gradually chased out of their homes and sent to concentration camps, robbed of everything they had. That happened to us as well, and we had to leave all the ground floor and its furnishings, a flat that has always been such a cozy home for us, carrying only the necessary clothes. We are setting out on a journey, not knowing the day of our return or when and where we can be united again. I am not certain whether I will see you again, so I decided to write these lines of goodbye to you. I deeply regret that I wasn't able to know your Ruth, that's my mom's name, and your family life. I wish both of you much, much happiness. I had a lot of failures in my life. However, when possible, I have tried to spare you from my shortcomings and help you become a doctor, a profession you always sought. You have always been a good boy, and we are proud of you. I wish for you to find full satisfaction in your profession. I also wish that your profession of curing doesn't just become a source of wealth for you, but that you, yourself, become a benefactor to the suffering humanity. So, that's a longer letter, but that is how I met my grandfather, and then I realized that my father, that was the life that he had led. He had led an extraordinary life in Melbourne that I witnessed that was well beyond what just, I believe, a normal, compassionate doctor does, because he got involved in a lot of things like Trinity Towers, which was the first high-rise in Melbourne that was for low-income residents. He did free rounds always at these nursing homes after he retired, his whole thing, and nurses told me that the residents would say that was, their favorite doctor and how much they loved him. He donated his time to Florida Institute of Technology for 10 years after he left his practice and didn't charge anything so that they could have a healthcare program for their students. And he donated that money, and then my mom and dad contributed the money for endowed scholarships. I don't know, I just watched him in what he did, and I realized that he lived out his dad's wish. The wish came to him in a letter sent to him after the war. What had happened was his father had left that letter with his sister that lived in Prague, and she was in a mixed marriage, and at that time they thought that she would be safe. It turned out through a lot of story that she was safe, and that family survived. And she had this letter in an envelope that said, "Don't open unless I don't return." And so after the war ended in the Czech lands, my parents were in South America. My father did his military service by he was assigned by the government to work on an oil field as a doctor in Ecuador, Peru and Ecuador. And that's where he was. And his aunt sent him that letter and said that her husband, Uncle Yaroslav, didn't want her to send it yet because they still hoped he would come back. but she felt like he needed to read it. So that's how my father learned from his dad, that Bible goodbye. So, I wish for all of you, as we all watch the Ukraine refugee situation, and there will come a time in America where we can do more. All those countries are taking them in, and I think the number could triple at the rate we're going, depending on what happens. But I think we all, if you can donate money or take someone in or help someone transition to a better life, I know it's going to mean a lot to a lot of people. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions?
Yes. Yes.
Do you reread these letters?
Use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So we can hear you.
Do you reread these letters often?
It's a good question, and I tell you, I do, because think of it, 400 multi-page letters by all these different people, and when I first was reading them, now 12 and 13 years ago, it was just, I couldn't believe it. Now I pull them out, and I'm actually been asked by 2 organizations that work with refugees. I have a lesson plan that has a lot of excerpts, and so now I'm going through it and looking. We need one especially that just are about how it feels to be a refugee, how it feels to be out there in the world. So yes, now I'm reading a lot of them again. It hurts because it's an echo of what's happening. It's just awful.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Judy, wait a minute. So we can all hear.
How many languages did your father end up speaking?
He ended up speaking many languages. He spoke Czech, German, some Russian, Spanish, Chinese. He had to take an immersion in Chinese language, and then there's one I'm forgetting. English.
I thought I saw someone here.
Barbara?
With all of us using email, you wonder if this type of book would be possible in the future. I guess, maybe if it's all saved in the cloud, but you just really wonder if we're going to be able to research things like we have in the past.
I absolutely agree with you. The letters, who writes a letter anymore? Who gets a letter from their kids? We know what's going to happen. And I was just writing up a piece that if anybody gets the Orlando Business Journal, it's going to be in there, but it's about the 1994 World Cup. I worked on that for 6 years as a volunteer in the bid and the hosting committee, and they asked me to write something. And what I wrote in it was the difference between when the announcement, March 23rd, this week, is the 30th anniversary of Orlando being named a venue for the games that happened in 1994 for FIFA's World Cup. And I wrote in there was no digital anything. You didn't have iPhones yet, you didn't have Google search, you didn't have, you had thermal fax paper, how you wrote. You didn't have, all the things we have now that I could never have done this. I never would have found the history of people, where to go, anything without the modern resources that we have. So we're way ahead, but on the letter writing and that kind of information keeping, I don't know. It's going to be gone.
Any other questions?
In your book, you mentioned there's a couple of chapters about your dad in China. Very interesting, fascinating. And when he first met your mother, and 5 weeks later they were married. There are some very romantic letters also. I thought it was very, very interesting. And I understand the marriage was, 60 years?
Yeah, 60 years, and it really was a love affair. They were very, very well matched.
And the other thing is, her father, as you mentioned, also went to Ecuador, from all places, during World War II. By then he was back in the United States, and as part of the military service, he was assigned to work at an oil company, an American oil company, that was part of the defense plan. But the book mentioned something that I thought was sort of funny, that at that time, in 1945, the United States dropped the atomic bomb in Japan. And I mentioned to Manuel, who was from Peru, because this happened in Ecuador, so an Ecuadorian general asked your dad, hey, could you get us one of those atomic bombs? We'd like to drop it on Peru.
Right.
Mentioned in the book, right?
Right.
Yeah. I I thought, whoa.
Yeah, because where they were stationed was right by a military base.
Right.
And so they were allowed to go to the officers' club.
Yeah.
My dad described this on my interviews, and those are the kind of stories that my father told them, they're great stories, but then when I put it all together, I was like,
Yeah,
wow.
it was an Equatorian big general.
Yeah.
Wanted to get an atomic bomb, just like
Yeah.
that. The other thing you mentioned, that when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, he did not cause any destruction, really. Well, first of all, the Sudetenland was transferred by the Accord, the Munich Accord and so on. So that was given to him without any force, any military force. But then, as we all know, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia. The way he did it, he summoned the president of Czechoslovakia to Berlin, and he summoned him, you have to be here tomorrow, just like that. And when he arrived, he said, okay, you have to sign this piece of paper transferring the whole country of Czechoslovakia to Germany. So the president of Czechoslovakia was named Hanna. He had a heart attack.
Yeah.
So with the cardiologist helping to write, the poor guy signed, he had a myocardial infarction and he did transfer. So yes, there was no destruction of Czechoslovakia. It was transferred to Germany that way.
Yeah. Joanie has books here on a table, so for those of you who would like to further investigate her wonderful letters, they're right here for your perusal. However, thank you very, very much. Thank you.